welcome to the Cybersecurity Agony Uncles podcast, or whatever this thing is. I'm Uncle Steve.
And I'm Uncle Rich. Good afternoon to you.
Fantastic. So, interesting discussion topic this time round. Rich, do you want to tell them what it is?
Yeah. So for this session, we are essentially piggybacking off of a slightly heated topic of conversation that came up on LinkedIn, and it is the question as to whether a CISO needs to be technical in order to be successful, essentially.
Yeah.
And there were strong arguments online from both sides of it, but I thought maybe today we could dig a little deeper.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing. It's one of those subjects that comes up for, well, I was going to say discussion, but comes up for a collective rant fairly regularly. So yeah, probably an interesting one to get stuck into. I mean, I know people can argue, or do argue, that there are you could argue either way with that question, but I think my personal view is that it's very difficult to be a leader in a space if you don't really know what that space does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I have a slight concern with the question.
Okay.
Because there are many ways in which you can be technical.
True. That's true. Yeah.
You know, you don't necessarily have to have come through an IT track to get into cybersecurity. You might have come through I don't know, compliance and risk management, and you can be technical in those fields, but be completely useless on the cyber tools. But would that make you any less of a CISO though? By the time you got to the top.
It's an interesting question. The underlying question is what actually is cybersecurity? What is information security actually trying to do? So, I mean, there are a couple of quotes that I'll kick off with, which kind of outline my position on this. And we can then sort of delve deeper into how this sort of broadens out into the fields that we're in. But the first quote that comes to my mind was a quote from Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, who said, I reckon that soldiers will be more likely to follow a leader in whose knowledge they have confidence, rather than someone with much greater personality, but not with the same obvious knowledge of his job. Okay, so I think that's quote number one. Quote number two comes out of a book, again, actually about, well, in fact, this one's about the North Africa campaign in World War II, and the author of the book is a chap called Corelli Barnett, and he says in there, however great the qualities of leadership in a man, okay, so it's, yes, we'll ignore the gender stuff, but the quote is, however great the qualities of leadership in a man, he cannot make use of them unless he is a master of the technical details of his profession, unless he knows his subordinates' jobs at least as well as they. Otherwise, his orders, made in partial ignorance, must be given and received with underlying diffidence.
Oh, that's
exactly.
a good one.
So, you know, if we're going to have an interesting.
Conversely, Steve Jobs always said he wanted to hire people smarter than him.
But I actually fully agree with that. I mean, as you might have guessed, the people that I employ are definitely better at the game than I am. Otherwise, I'm not here to tell. Actually, that's another really good quote. I think it was from I can't quite get this one right, and I haven't got a copy of it to hand, but it was one from Patton, again, World War Two. But something along the lines of not telling people how to do things, but effectively telling people what the outcome is, and being surprised at something about the way they get about doing it, or something like that. But there's a whole piece around that being a very good attitude to leadership. You don't want to employ people and then tell them what to do. You want to be employing people and telling them what you want the outcome to be, and letting them then get on and deliver the outcome to you. But in order to know what the outcome should be, surely you need to understand how you would get to that outcome yourself. Whether you choose, how do you know it's a good outcome unless you understand what's involved?
Yeah, absolutely. And that then becomes a question of where the CISO role is positioned.
Yeah.
Because if it sits at the board, or is it, that's a very different proposition to it's a middle management role or a senior management role.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we're sort of talking about layering skills here.
Yeah.
So, the crux of the matter is that, in my mind, no amount of policy or process or risk management tooling or whatever it may be is actually going to stop information security breaches. It certainly isn't going to stop determined adversarial groups. Those things are actually prevented technically.
Yes.
And I appreciate I'm probably going to get absolutely trolled over this, but so what the hell? But in the end, it's a technical issue because we are dealing with stuff which is being held on technology, and the right people having access to the right stuff in the right ways. I mean, it's sort of like saying, well, if I have a policy that says criminals may not enter my front door, okay, that doesn't really matter if I haven't locked the front door, because they're not going to read the policy and go, "Oh right, I'll go next door then, shall I?"
Yeah.
They're going to walk in through the open front door and walk off with, I don't know, whatever they can find. So I need to know that in order to prevent my house being burgled, I have to undertake a certain level of technical security, as in closing windows and locking doors and other bits and pieces. I don't have to be the guy that knows how to build the locks to know that that's what needs to be done. And I think it's the same underlying concept works in a technical world, in my view, that you need to understand how the technology is protecting the organization, and then how to the rest of it as you become more senior, certainly when you get to CISO level, it's around, well, yes, you could technically lock down everything, but then that's going to be an impedance to the business success. As in, if you just disconnected everything from networks. In fact, if you turned off all the computers, you'd be technically that will prevent anybody from hacking your computer. Well, except possibly the NSA or whoever. But you know what I mean. You need to then be balancing what are the right things to do in order to address the actual business risks. And that's the bit where you need to go beyond technical skills and be able to understand business risk. But I don't think that works well if you don't understand what it is that you're actually doing when you're protecting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I've never heard of anyone becoming an overnight CISO from a junior level role.
No.
It shouldn't happen. And if it does happen, then you should run a mile from that organisation, frankly.
Yeah,
But
right. Yeah.
the whole process of getting into a senior role, even if it does unexpectedly land on your desk, um, is really you only get those opportunities if you've been around the block a few times. You know, the idea is that you've cut your teeth on at the more junior levels where you've been on the tools, you know what's what, and preferably you've seen it in multiple companies that have multiple different structures and technologies and things like that. You're supposed to have been knocked around a bit before you get to the CISO role and knocked into shape. So so you should have some kind of technical background. And I'm not sure if it makes much of a difference whether you came via IT or started off, I don't know, as a SOC analyst or something.
No, I don't think it does really. I think it's more about yeah. I think the route in probably doesn't matter too much in that respect. I think some of the best people I've worked with have not. They're not historically from the cyber side of tech. They've come in from the tech side of tech,
Yeah.
and have, can see how what they've been doing in the past has got a security element to it and decided that's the direction they want to go in. So no, you don't need to start out as a SOC analyst or whatever that may be. You may actually have started out working on the help desk. It doesn't really matter. It's how you developed your career and built those skills. So I suppose the question here is, what are organizations putting themselves at risk if their most senior person responsible for security comes from a background which has been effectively, without beating around the bush, we're talking about GRC, this GRC side of
Yeah.
cyber, and I think I would not argue that GRC is useless. I think it's actually very useful. I think it's certainly if risk is done properly, it creates the framework in which all the rest of it needs to be done. But are you able to properly articulate and work with risk if you don't understand the technologies which are potentially generating some of that risk?
Yeah, exactly. And it's very much a question of blind spots.
Yeah.
No matter what career path you took to get into the CISO role, you're gonna have some blind spots, and so I think it becomes kind of a personality question almost. Are you the sort of person that is willing to admit you have blind spots, or even be able to identify that and then do something about it? Or are you going to trust vendors? If you come from a GRC background and you say, I've got risks in these areas to a software vendor, they will turn around and say, oh, we can sell you software that will eliminate all risks, because that's what they do.
Yeah, no, that is quite true. That is quite true. And to some extent, employing people that know the answers to some of those questions may be a mitigation to the risk of not actually knowing this stuff yourself. Whether that's more of a sustainable workaround rather than a complete mitigation to the a fix of the root cause, I'm not sure. But you can probably get around that. But then if you look at other C-level roles, would you argue that a good CFO doesn't need to understand company finance and accounting?
Well, yeah, quite good point. I would expect them to know it in intricate detail. They might not necessarily be, I don't know, a tax specialist or something.
No, exactly. Yeah, precisely. And yes, but do they understand what the junior in accounts payable does? Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They do. They don't do it themselves, because actually they're looking after a vast amount of stuff above and beyond that, and somebody has to focus on that particular piece. But they know what that piece does, And if you put them back in that chair again, they might not be the fastest at it anymore, but they would certainly get the right outcome. Or, the head of HR, would you argue that the head of HR doesn't need to have an understanding of UK employment law? It would be difficult to do that job well unless you had that understanding. Again, you don't necessarily want to be, you don't necessarily need to know all of the ins and outs of every act, but you need to know what is being done. You need to understand things like, broadly health and safety law, employment law, all various aspects, enough to have people that are working with you that can go, right, okay, well, this particular person deals with, legally recruiting people, or this particular person is looking after benefits, but they know what the concepts are and they understand what the outcomes are meant to be. And could they do the job? Well, they probably could. So I don't know that you can really properly run the role of CISO unless you're at that level. So yes, you do need to understand the GRC side of things. Yes, you do need to understand actually how security is enabling the business to succeed, but you also need to understand how is it being implemented. Not necessarily sit at a router and harden it, but you need to know that routers need hardening, and you need to know that if you talk to somebody about have you done it, that they've actually done the right things. They're not just telling you they've done stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really it's a case of you need to know the broad strokes.
Yeah.
I mean, fine, you might have come up via a specialism in one key area, but you need to know the broad strokes at least of everything. And you need to have that team who report into you, or via their own managers or whatever, who actually know the intricate detail of configuring these things.
Yeah.
Who can flag up warnings about things you may have missed potentially.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would agree with you on that.
Yeah, it's kind of fired up a strange debate on LinkedIn, in that people were very strongly polarized on it. There was none of this middle ground that says your mileage may vary, different businesses have different risks, and so on and so forth, and have different needs. But it was amazing how polarized the conversation was on LinkedIn. Some people were like, "No, because you're not on the tools. You're never going to touch the tools ever again. You don't need to know that stuff." And other people were saying, slightly more rationally, in my opinion, that if you come up via the tools, then you have a more intrinsic knowledge that you're taking into the senior role to actually create strategies that are going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the end, if you are sat on the board, or you that exco level, you're responsible for these things. And how do you know that the things that are being done on the technical side of the organisation are actually protecting you? If you don't understand at least at some level technically what is being done. I agree that knowing which box to tick on a tool somewhere is probably that's not the level that I'm talking about.
No.
But knowing that there are things that need to be done, and those things are not they are not non-technical things, though they are things that have to actually be done technically in order to know that you are secure.
Yeah, in fact, I would go so far as to say it is irresponsible to not be well informed enough to actually take responsibility, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a comment that's just come up around becoming too reliant on tech teams that don't value security, and I think there is that is a risk, and we've seen that. We have both, I know, worked with and for people who perhaps weren't as on top of this stuff as they should have been. and literally have just effectively had the wool pulled over their eyes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that comes down, it comes down also to the way that responsibilities are cascaded down through an organisation. So, if the tech team's KPIs are, and as they should be, they should most definitely include stuff like service delivery. So, if the website goes offline, we're losing 10 million a minute, kind of thing. Well, yeah. So resilience and whatever is that is something which will be a very important KPI. But if those KPIs don't also include securing the stuff that's being done, they won't be the things that are being focused on. Because in the end, no matter how much we all like to think that we try to do the right thing regardless of what we may be tasked with, most people in the end will vote with their. They'll either take the path of least resistance or they'll vote with their wallet. And if you're going to get a bonus off the back of hitting your KPIs, you're not going to do things that will get in the way of doing your KPIs or things that are not KPIs. And very rarely does anybody get to a position where they've got time, energy, and ability to do things once they've completed all their KPIs. But very quickly, you find more KPIs will be added to you at that point. The whole part. There is an argument that says the whole point of KPIs is to make sure that nobody ever gets a bonus.
Yeah, and I can picture it now. Most people's jobs don't involve security or even considering security.
No.
And so they are interested, like in making engineers are interested in making things work.
Yeah.
Essentially, they're not. Security will be a secondary consideration for them, if at all.
Yep. Yep. So where if the person responsible for security doesn't get the tech, where is that being looked after in the organisation? And I see that as being a significant gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why it is important to have a segregation of duties. You can't just force security onto IT necessarily, because
I agree.
not only are they marking their own homework, but also they're not. No matter how much you shout at an IT team, they're not going to be as invested in security. They'll see it as something, they have to do, but beyond that, no, probably slightly less interested.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. But that comes down to company culture.
Yeah,
and that stuff cascades from quite high in the organisation. So yes, you can work in places where the tech teams actually do get it and they do care about it.
yeah,
And that's partly because they'll be they will be measured on it. So somebody does anybody care if I do this? It's just in the back of the mind of most tech people. It's I can do this. Is anybody going to notice if I don't do this? Is it are there more interesting things I could be doing? But if somebody is actually they know that somebody cares about it, they can see that the reason for doing things securely is because it helps the business, and the business then is helping them, as it were, to have a job and have an income and do some interesting stuff. Then it aligns. I think it's only when the culture of security is a bolt-on around the edges, or it's just seen as being a load of the department of no is how it used to be referred to 10, 15, 20 years ago. No, you can't do that. Well, how am I supposed to get the job done then? Well, I don't know. It's not my problem. But you can't do that. Which is, we still come across this this attitude, and often I've seen a disjoin then between, say, what ends up in a policy and what actually has to happen on the ground in order to get the job done. And the difficulty with that is the people writing the policies don't really understand the actual processes that are needed in order for the business to succeed. Not at that level. They may get the business process, but they don't understand what do people need to do day in, day out in order to do the job. So that again requires a level of understanding of the technology. To kind of a good example, many years ago, I worked in a finance organisation that took security immensely, that really seriously. Everything that could be secured was secured. No risks could be. Any identified risk had to be addressed head on. You couldn't accept or mitigate or whatever.
Right.
We reckoned at the time that in tech, somewhere between 50 and 75% of the budget was spent on securing stuff.
Wow.
And from the CEO down, all of these things that were being done created friction between the business and the tech people, who were seen as being the impeding stuff, even though whenever the tech team came up with strategies that involved making people's working lives easier, they were vetoed by security, saying you can't do that. So I think that was a very good example of the CISO in that organisation really didn't understand the technologies behind what was being done. It understood what the outcomes needed to be, as in he was tasked solely with making sure that nothing ever got, there were no data leaks and there were no outages caused by information security or cyber issues, and just doggedly pursued that with complete disregard to the technology or the business processes that underpinned the success of that particular organisation. I mean, in fairness, whilst I was there, to the best of our knowledge, the systems never got hacked. They certainly, it was critical global infrastructure. It always, every single day, it did its job whilst I was there. But it was bloody painful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's also kind of a belief that people can spend their way out of trouble.
Yeah.
And the difficulty with that is, of course, is that if you don't know what you're spending your money on, then are you really spending your way out of trouble? Or are you just going to leave significant gaps? Are you going to have too many overlapping products and
Yeah.
technologies that still leave the same gaps uncovered?
There is one of the themes, I think, of these podcasts is that the vendor environment does not do itself or its customers much in the way of favors with this. If you go to any vendor and say, I've got a problem, their starting point is, well, I've got a solution. I don't really care what your problem is. It's so, yeah, you're quite right. And there's some very expensive tooling that gets sold in very large quantities, which, whilst it does its actual job very well, is presented as being the panacea to all ills, and it just isn't. You can end up blowing your budget on something that looks and sounds amazing, but actually hasn't done much to help you.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you need some technical knowledge in order to be able to cut through the sales nonsense on these websites, PDFs, white papers, you name it, in order to determine, actually, is this product going to be a good fit for my organization?
I would agree with that. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, I gave a talk around how come we don't seem to be doing a great job in cyber. And part of the issue then was that at that point, there were well over 2,000 tools or services that you could buy, which purported to deal with cybersecurity in one way or another. Okay, well, even coming from a technical background and having certainly a reasonable high-level grip on what the tech should be doing to deal with these issues, I couldn't say, hand on heart, I could understand which of these 2,000 tools was the right tool to do a particular job.
Yeah.
I couldn't guarantee that, I might have heard of this one and used it and like it, but the other one that I've never used and only know superficially might actually be better. So even with a good grasp on the technical side of how you secure things, it's really difficult if you're relying on vendors to tell you this is the thing that you should be buying. So, again, how would you address that issue if you've got multi-million pound budgets, which will include tools and services from somewhere in that pool, which must be way north of 2,000 things now? How do you know that you're spending the money on the things that actually are making you more secure if you don't understand what those things are?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the long and short of it is that yes, you do need technical skills,
Yeah.
and a broad set of them too. By the time you reach CISO level,
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Now, just in order for balance, I don't think that this means you should be able to promote people from hands-on techie to CISO role and them succeed in it. I think there are a whole load of other leadership and business skills that you need to pick up on your way to
oh yeah,
sorts of levels, and not least of which comes down to how do you lead teams. Because other than the one-man band, where actually the CISO is really just the techie, in most organizations, by the time you've got a C-level role, you will have a management team looking after a whole bunch of things that are within your broader remit. You need to be able to lead those people. You need to also be able to understand, things like budgeting. You need to be able to, deal with. There's a whole host of other stuff which comes in at that point. And yeah, you do. If you've come from a technical background, you do need to understand how risk works, and you do need to be able to do the bit which a lot of people struggle with is actually understanding the intersection between cyber risk and business risk.
yeah,
Which going back to my finance days, well, you could say every risk is a business risk, because if something highly improbable happens, the outcome might be this. Well, yeah, okay, and if you've got enormous pockets, you can take that approach, but mostly businesses are not like that. And often, if you ask business people what are the most important key processes in the business, they're not necessarily going to come up with the things that the tech team would come up with. So they may well be saying things like, well, actually, our payroll or our invoicing system, in fact, is the most important thing in this entire business. We can survive with an outage of our production systems for X number of hours or days or whatever it would be, but if we can't invoice people, we'll go underwater within a month.
yeah.
So you get different answers, and so being able to understand those sorts of intersections. So that goes beyond the technical skills into the much more into the business skills and leadership skills. So you've got to have those in addition, but you can't. I don't think it works if you've got those non-tech skills, but you don't have a proper understanding of how technology is actually defending you.
Nice, very nice. I think you've summed that up far better than I ever could.
I just feel like I've been on a half an hour rant, actually. And this, by the way, is why I don't join in when I see these things kicking off on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever it would be. Well, unless there's anything else, Rich, that you want to add to that,
No, I'm quite happy.
I think I'm just going to have to stop ranting.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to our audience for listening, and I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. Thank you all. Bye bye.
Bye.